Welcome to the CAST Pulse podcast. I'm Carlos Beck Viana, and this is the podcast from the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, where we bring you science-based perspectives on the issues shaping the future of U.S. agriculture. Before we get into today's episode, a few updates from CAST. The 2025 Borlaug CAST Communication Award ceremony honoring Dr. David Ortega of Michigan State University has been rescheduled and now will take place on Tuesday, March 3rd, 2026 at 6 p.m. Eastern at Madison Hall at the Library of Congress. The event will also feature the presentation of the CAST Science Communication Scholarship. More details are available at cast-science.org. Also, if you haven't had a chance to check out two recent CAST publications and their webinars, head to cast-science.org or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/castagscience. The first publication is Precision Irrigation Management, which covers how technologies like variable rate irrigation systems and soil sensors are helping producers improve water efficiency and climate resilience. The second is Animal and Plant Source Proteins as part of a balanced human diet, which examines the nutritional, environmental, and societal dimensions of protein production from both animal and plant sources. Now to today's episode. In December 2025, CAST announced the formation of a Strategic Advisory Council, an 18-member body drawn from academia, industry, government, and nonprofit organizations. The SAC has been charged with assessing what it would take for CAST to evolve into the National Academy of Agriculture, and is expected to deliver recommendations to the CAST Board of Directors by mid-2026. Today, we sit down with the chair of that council, Ray Starling, General Counsel of the North Carolina Chamber and President of the North Carolina Chamber Legal Institute. Ray brings a background that spans a century family farm in southeast North Carolina, a law degree from UNC Chapel Hill, senior roles in North Carolina state government, service as Special Assistant to the President for Agriculture in the first Trump administration, and Chief of Staff to USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue. He now leads legal strategy at the statewide Chamber of Commerce in North Carolina. In this conversation, Ray talks about why alignment, and not technology alone, is the central challenge facing U.S. agriculture, what the SAC is actually trying to do, and why he thinks the country needs something like a National Academy of Agriculture right now. Let's get into it.
Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what your career path has looked like, and what you're up to now?
Yeah, it's funny we're starting with probably the least interesting question, for me to tell you about myself. I think the headline that I'll start with, and then I'll back up a little bit chronologically. Probably the most pivotal career moment in my career was when I got a phone call early one morning and was invited to come to the White House and interview to be the president's special assistant for agriculture, which of course I pursued and ended up doing. That was very early in the first Trump administration. I actually reported to a guy named Gary Cohn on the National Economic Council. Did that work for about 15 months in the Trump White House, and then went over to USDA to be the Chief of Staff to Secretary Perdue. That was also an incredible experience. Did that for a year and then returned to North Carolina, partly because I had only gone to D.C. with the hope of being up there a couple of years. And at that point, I was there well over 4. But also my mother had gotten sick and my parents were in poor health. So we decided to return back to North Carolina to try to be more helpful in that situation. But how did I get there? Frankly, it all started, as it should, on a family farm. I grew up on a family farm in southeast North Carolina. It was a century family farm, meaning there are parts of that agricultural operation that had been in our family for over 100 years. In fact, I think at this point, we could probably apply for the 200-year certification and also get that. But great experience. We used my friends on the farm to work out in the tobacco fields of southeast North Carolina as I was growing up, and it was really a formative experience that I'm super grateful to have had. It also instilled, as it seems to do among farm kids, quite a bit of pride about the agricultural industry. And so I took that with me into my education. I was a big FFA and 4-H person. Those were both very formative organizations to me as well. I had the opportunity in the middle of college, while I was studying to being an ag ed teacher, an FFA advisor, which I still think is probably one of the coolest jobs in America. But while I was doing that, I got to be a national FFA officer which really sort of opened my eyes to the fact that there are a lot of places in agriculture that you can make a difference. And at the time, my observation was that frankly, the technical side of agriculture, the scientist and the chemist that were working in the field to make ag better, that they were going to figure that out, right? They were going to get the science part better and better and better, right? And that is in fact what's happened, right? I was at least clairvoyant in that way, in that that's exactly what's happened. I mean, the technology advancements that we've made in agriculture over the course of the last 30 years are mind-boggling, not to mention technological advancements we've made all the way back since World War II. And what I observed during that National FFA officer experience, though, was it will not be that is the limitation on our ability to move forward. It will be how those things play out in more of sort of the social science fields, the political world, the legal world, the public relations world. And that's where I wanted to operate. I realized that would be a limiting factor on the positive successes of the more, again, technical or scientific side of the industry. And so I wanted to work in that space. I finished at NC State with a degree in ag ed and went to UNC Chapel Hill to law school. I wrote my essay to say that's what I wanted to do. When I got out, I wanted to work in that space. And I've been super fortunate that that's where my career ultimately took me, to a State Department of Agriculture, then to the Speaker of the House's office here in North Carolina, who I followed up to Washington, D.C. He became a United States Senator, Senator Tom Tillis. Worked for him for a couple of years, became his chief of staff, and then had the opportunity at the White House and over at USDA. And if there's anybody still awake, then in 2019, I came back to North Carolina because I had an opportunity to work for the statewide Chamber of Commerce. And frankly, I love it. It is a place that just gives me a platform to do all the things I enjoy doing, working in the political space, working certainly in the public policy influence space, working on legal issues that impact the business community, but certainly within that, the agricultural community. And frankly, they're very good to me here, and they let me do things like volunteer to help with CAST. So that's the background, more than you wanted to know. I think I'll be in trouble if I don't throw in, I have a very small family. My wife, who is actually in academia, she has a PhD in mathematics education. She's a math teacher and professor over at the local liberal arts school here in Raleigh. And then a 15-year-old daughter who certainly keeps us hopping, and with whom I battle frequently in basketball. And as I'm getting older, and as she is getting older, she is winning more, an increasing majority of those contests. So that's us in a nutshell.
So your journey spans, like you said, growing up on a century farm, serving in senior roles at the USDA and the White House, and now leading legal strategy at the NC Chamber. So all of this put together, your life in a nutshell, how do those experiences really shape the way you think about the future of U.S. agriculture and the leadership needs?
Yeah, great question. Hard question to think about how it's shaped. I think I'll tweak the question a little bit and say, what do I come away with as my biggest observation, having sat in all those different rooms and in all those different places over that time? And I think it's kind of answering the same question. And that is just observing that the hardest part of what we do, I think, in agriculture is with such a disaggregated industry that literally operates in all states, and that even within the industry has all of these subparts and lots of different sectors, subsectors, if you will. To me, the big takeaway is our challenge is consistently alignment. How do you put all of those things together and kind of row in one direction, at least at a very high leadership level, right? I recognize you're going to have folks that are growing soybeans in one part of the country are going to have different needs and different interests than those that are growing fruits and vegetables in another part of the industry. But how do we bring all of the agricultural thought leaders and all of the agricultural subsectors together to be aligned to pursue an agenda, if you will, or at least a direction, if you will, that raises all boats, regardless of what subsector of agriculture you're working in? And frankly, we hear a lot of criticism about the way public policy is made and who gets looked after and who does not, and who gets to be at the table and who does not. And I think those voices have gotten louder. I think if we're being objective, I think there's good reason, right, for both how we've ended up with the system we have and why there are calls to reform that system and to have a conversation about that. And so for me, it all comes down to alignment. How do we get everybody pulling in the same direction, or I like to say rowing in the same direction? not just on agricultural research, which is probably near and dear to anybody that's listening to this particular podcast, but we have that challenge in the ag labor space, right? How do we get folks from California and folks from North Carolina on the same page about how we reform ag labor policy in this country? We have that conversation I mentioned or alluded to just a second ago about the agricultural safety net. How do we make that work for everybody across agriculture in a way that frankly honors our country's commitment to free enterprise and to the fact that the farmers also are taking great risk in this process? Trade is in the news now every single day. That was a part of my portfolio when I worked at the White House. How do we make sure that we're benefiting everyone in the ag sector across the United States on the trade front and not picking just certain subpopulations or winners and losers? And so I summed that up, and I'm pretty sure I stole this from somebody, but I also heard, and so I guess I stole this as well, that if you're a speaker or you continually use an illustration, the first time you use it, you actually give credit to the person that you learned it from and say, so-and-so taught me so-and-so. And then a few months later, you may use the phrase, I one time heard, and then another 6 months or a year later, it's your idea. And so with all due respect to whoever inspired me or whoever actually said this first, one of the things about agriculture in the United States that I think is unique, fascinating, interesting, and probably deserves a whole historical breakdown of how we got here. And some of it, I think, relates to just the personality of the United States, the kinds of things de Tocqueville would have said when he came to observe us a couple hundred years ago. We have aligned ourselves in lots of different community organizations within agriculture. And I call those verticals. Like we've got ag verticals that focus only on cotton, only on pork, only on fill in the blank, rice, whatever. And they're all very good, right? So farmers belong to these groups. We call them commodity associations in some sense, trade associations and others. And so there's lots of good vertical alignment in agriculture. And this is true of the academicians that would be at the table in the ag research space as well. They have multiple organizations that they plug into. The Public Land Grant Universities entity, of course, CAST is an example of this. So the question is, with all of that vertical alignment, how are we doing in agriculture on horizontal alignment? How do we take care of the problems facing not just smaller issues maybe, and that's not a term of disrespect, it's just an issue that doesn't impact all of agriculture. How do we get to a conversation about those things that do in fact impact all of agriculture? And I've written about this before, having sat on the other side of the table, particularly in the public policy sphere, where it's all about priorities and knowing you're only going to be able to do the top 3 or 4. You can't do all 10. In particular, ag research is on everybody's agenda, but it's on everybody's agenda at number 7, 8, 9, or 10. And so when it gets down to time to really sort of press you, and I mean, again, I've seen and been a part of these conversations on the other side of the United States government where we brought people in and said, okay, I understand, Kaylee, that you think all of this is important, but what do you absolutely have to have? And what do you absolutely have in the short term? How do we get you fixed in the short term and most quickly and get you a win and us a win too? That might get you to number 3 on the list, but it never gets you to number 7. And so frankly, what we need is some long-term horizontal thinking in the industry. And that's my big takeaway. And frankly, that's why I'm excited about being a part of this effort, because I think it does some of that, or is set up if we do it right.
CAST recently announced the formation of the Strategic Advisory Council. So could you expand a little bit more on that effort? Explain what it is, what sorts of individuals are members, and the primary goals of this group?
Yeah, great question, Kaylee. Thank you. I would say to start with, let's don't overcomplicate it. It's an advisory council. So let's have some truth in advertising. It is indeed advisory. We do not have authority to determine the future steps of CAST. That is a duty that will be well performed by the CAST board and its staff leadership. But I do think we're true to that term, advisory, as well. I mean, it is the intention of the people that have gotten around this table to give robust input and to be part of a robust debate about the future of agricultural research more generally, but certainly how CAST wants to help shape, inform, and influence that. It is outside voices that are different than the CAST board. So there's some autonomy, I think, given to the Strategic Advisory Council, that we have permission and are not guardrailed by maybe very, very holy beliefs that the CAST board may have. And I say that respectfully, not as a cynical thing, but I think that's what they were looking for. I mean, kudos to them for asking a group of outsiders that we're not seeing at their board, hey, go think about this and bring us back some ideas and some direction. And so to your question, so then to advise on what, right? Like you're a strategic advisory group. You understand what strategy or strategic maneuvering is. We understand what an advisory group is, but what is the underlying mission? And I think, frankly, and I alluded to this a second ago, how is CAST best positioned to lead in what I call the modern era? And by modern, it's not a social science term. I'm not referring to sort of modernity. I'm referring to post 2025. How are recognizing, sensing, feeling like there's a need for leadership and guidance here? How can CAST and CAST's cast of characters, if you will, the folks that normally plug into CAST, those that care deeply about agricultural research and science and technology innovation in the country, how do we actually think about how to lead post 2025? And so I think that leads to thinking a little bit bigger. How do we have this? How do we generate a space where there can be a coordinated vision on agricultural science and technology? I think the focus will probably be, at least there'll be a bias toward thinking about how we align, again, a word I love in this space, align our public resources, those dollars that are coming from, in particular, the federal government, but also to some extent the state, that are being matched by private sector and other sort of philanthropic funds. How do we align in a way that public thinking that actually reflects the potential that we have in the private market and brings those two synergies together? So there's a lot of private industry folks around the table for this conversation. We have those folks on the advisory council, but we're also heavy on the folks from the academy who are generally tasked with doing this work. And so I think the idea is to pull that group together, to think about public resource alignment, to think about how the private sector can plug into that and give direction on that and make sure that those two different parts of the economy, if you will, or different ways of thinking about agriculture are really aligned. So it's a heady mission. It's a big task. And frankly, I think what CAST realized months ago, or probably even years ago, was that there's a void there, and there's room to grow and there's room to take leadership in that work. As far as the members of the advisory committee, all of this is available out there. You can go literally look name by name at the folks that are on the advisory council. What I would say just briefly is, again, plenty of private sector engagement. I would put myself in that category. I mean, I work at a statewide nonprofit, but it's a nonprofit that advocates on behalf of the business community. I mean, we have agricultural enterprises as our members who pay our dues and do our evaluations, frankly, every year. So the private sector, very important. Clearly, a number of thought leaders from some of the best land-grant universities across the country, people that care deeply about this mission of alignment. And then, frankly, just some folks that, I mean, I'm sure they would not describe themselves this way, partly because they're humble, but partly because they have real jobs and draw real salaries. But I like to call them thought leaders and thinkers. And so some names that folks would recognize and trust and understand, hey, this person thinks out of the box and is a real leader in this space. And even ag trade association leaders, not that they don't fit into some of those other categories already, but they are charged. If you run a large trade association in agriculture, you're charged already with representing a wide array of views. And so bringing that to our table and helping us understand what your members are thinking about, what you're concerned about, is important. I would just say kudos to CAST and to the staff of CAST who helped put the SAC together. I think they did a very good job checking a number of boxes. It was also important to me that we have a producer at the table, a farmer. It's so funny on that word producer versus farmer. Like 25 years ago, everybody ran around and said, we need to professionalize farmers and call them producers. That turned out to be horrible advice. Nobody cares about a producer, but people actually seem to like farmers. And so we're going to have some farmer input at the table. Farmers already have a hard time managing their operations and doing everything they have to do. But I think we found one or two that are willing to sit at our table and give us input here. And no doubt that will keep us grounded. And I think that's important.
Talking a little bit more about the SAC and what they're doing, what do you think success will look like for that council?
Yeah, I can't help but build on what you just said, Kaylee, because you talked about excitement. when I think about my list of things we want to accomplish, they're not necessarily in any order, but I had excitement down as like number 3, enthusiasm or some sort of gaining momentum or spirit about this work. But I think that's important. I mean, I really do. I mean, we run out of gas if we don't have the enthusiasm or the excitement around the mission. And what that tells us, and that's a fun word to say, fun word to think about, but I feel like behind that, what it tells us is we're doing meaningful work, right? I mean, a lot of conversation today about people in the workplace and are they finding meaning in their work? And I can't think of much in terms of agricultural leadership that is more meaningful than the effort we're trying to undertake here. I think other characteristics of a successful run at this include emerging with some sort of consensus on direction of where we want to go, not just taking for granted that we want to form something. I'm sure we're going to talk about this idea of a National Academy of Agriculture. We won't take that for granted. We'll walk into that conversation being very thoughtful about, is that the right thing to do? Is that the right place to go? But I hope at the end, across all of these views and across all of the just brilliant individuals that are sitting at this table, myself excluded from that adjective. And by the way, I think it's a little intimidating to sit at this table and be tasked with helping to lead and facilitate them, because they're just rock stars. All of them individually are rock stars. It's a real honor. If I didn't say that before, I should have. So at the end, getting that group to feel some real consensus around, okay, this is the direction we concluded in which we need to go. Obviously, that's important. I think number 2, we've got to be inclusive of many different perspectives. We've got to listen to a lot of different stakeholders. That unfortunately slows us down, but it's super, super important work. There's a phrase I love, which is, and some politician said this years ago, see, I'm doing it again. I'm forgetting who said it and taking credit myself. But if folks aren't on the plane when it takes off, they most certainly will not be with you when the plane lands. And so we've got to get a lot of folks onto the tarmac and then eventually get them into the plane as it takes off so that they'll be with us when it lands. So an inclusive process that represents a myriad of views from lots of different backgrounds and lots of different parts of this wide array of agricultural industry we have. And again, the enthusiasm piece, I told you that was third in my mind. And then I think lastly, when you've done all those things, then it can be defensible, right? Like I've been involved in efforts before where we are so confident of our outcome that we recognize there will be people that disagree with us. But in our minds, that is okay, because we feel like what we are doing is defensible. Not to say we won't make mistakes, not to say we won't realize 6 months later we should have thought about something a little bit differently. But at the end of the day, I think you want a process. If your process is defendable and defensible, then I think you're going to get a product that not all the time, but most of the time is also easy to defend and easy to explain. And to be able to say things like, I hear you. In fact, I used to think that myself, but going through this process, here's what we learned. Here's what people told us. Here's actually what the data ultimately revealed to us. And so to put maybe a little funny story on it, I'm a big fan of the movie. They're really old now. Kaylee, you probably never even heard of it. But the movie is called The American President. Don't ask me who the stars of it are. I don't remember like movie stars' names very well. But there's a line in it. And of course, the story is the president. He's actually single. He ends up falling in love with a lobbyist and there's scandal. I mean, wouldn't that be refreshing? And long story short, he is talking to his staff at some point. He wants to bring her to a dance at the White House. And he's talking to his staff and he says, I want to invite this lobbyist or this lady. And a staffer says, the American people are going to have things to say about that. And the president sort of recoils and is like, it's not the business of the American people if I want to bring a date to the White House, to an event. I think it's like a state dinner or something, which, I mean, let's talk about a flex, right? If you're a single president of the United States and you invite a lady to come to a state dinner, that's pretty good. I mean, might not be as good as riding in a combine and picking soybeans, but it's still pretty good. And so this staffer says, the line that I remember is, the American people have a funny way of deciding what is and isn't their business. I think that's a transcendental line that can be applied in way more than politics. And so for those of us that are trying to be volunteer leaders, particularly for an industry as big and as arrayed as this one, I think a lot of people have a funny way of deciding what is and isn't their business. And there's a lot of people that think what we're working on is their business. And if they think that, then they're probably right? And they get to decide. I mean, again, just another vestige of of the independence of American thought leaders. And so with that said, we've got to get a lot of those people and their opinions considered. And so our process also has to do that. How do you do that in a way that allows you to take in hundreds of items of feedback? I mean, we're going to have to figure that out, because it can't just be the 20 of us and the people we talk to. We've also got to have, I think, a tool in this process that allows larger groups of people to submit comments or to take a survey and give us feedback. And so that way we won't be blindsided by those folks that decided this was a part of their business. We love that. We want to encourage that. So, and some, if I can, to kind of go back through them, because I'm trying to think in Roman numerals, I think consensus on direction, concluding with an idea and a consensus on where we want to go, inclusive of many perspectives, enthusiastic and excited about the outcome. To have a defensible process probably means to have a defensible result. And then lastly, we got to listen to people who think this is their business, because it probably is.
So it was alluded to in some of our previous conversation, but not actually ever said out loud. You are serving as the chair of the Strategic Advisory Council, right? So as you're leading this cross-sector group that's tasked with evaluating whether CAST should or should not evolve into the National Academy of Agriculture, what are some of those top outcomes that you need the SAC to deliver during this very first phase?
Yeah, well, I mean, frankly, I think in the first phase, early on, I think it is living up to those ideals that I just mentioned. I mean, I think it is the idea of being inclusive. It is the idea of having a process that people buy into and understand is going to be methodical. It is building the enthusiasm and the excitement around it, and letting folks who think it's their business be at the table and give us feedback. So I think early on, and that's the hard part. Like, it truly is the hard part. You don't want to get to the end and say, I wish I had done it differently. So, and our colleague, Chris, he may already be frustrated that I'm not moving fast enough, but I think this first few weeks and this first sort of how do we come out of the gate, we've got to be super thoughtful about that, because we're building the framework that we're going to work through, and it's going to be much harder to come back at the end and slide something in. And so I just want to be super deliberate about how we set up a platform that allows us to do all those things that we said were our goals.
We've kind of touched on this a little bit in our conversation so far, but specifically, why do you think the United States needs a National Academy of Agriculture?
Yeah, I love this question. And again, another line from another person that I've stolen over the years. And honestly, I would give him credit. And I read it in a book, and I've misplaced the book, so I don't remember the title of it. But he says, I get the idea that some people think my ideas are stupid and they don't agree with me. And I get that idea because after they hear my ideas, they come up to me and say, I think your ideas are stupid and I don't agree with you. And so fair enough. You may think what I'm about to say is stupid and you may not agree with me. But I am a believer in the social science observation these days that we are in an era, particularly in the United States. I think this is endemic around the world a little bit, but certainly here in the United States, that we are in an era of a feeling that our institutions have failed us, that in some way our institutions are broken and that we do not trust them anymore. Let me go ahead and just plug here an author whose name I do remember and probably just super influential on me. I finally got to meet him a few months ago, and I fanboyed so much that I think I made a fool of myself. But there's a guy at the American Enterprise Institute called Yuval Levin. Yuval is just an incredible thinker about the way the political construct in particular is being influenced by social forces. And one of those is this, and he sets it up and defends it very well in his book, A Time to Build, that we are in a phase of failed trust in institutions. And of course, he talks about maybe the causes of that and how we emerge from it, more importantly. But with that said, I think the real question when people throw that out there, and you see it in the Gallup poll, you see it in the Pew poll, you see it in the work Chicago does, you see it in the work that AEI does and their research. But I think the real question to ask is, okay, so what does that mean, right? Like if I ask people how much you trust the banks or the business community or farmers or the academy or Congress or the Supreme Court, we can trace the data, right? We've got the longitudinal data to show we've been asking those questions for decades now. We can show there's less trust today than there might have been at a previous time in history. I think what's unique about today is when those lines used to go up and down, depending on what was actually happening in society at the moment. So the Supreme Court's like an easy one to talk about. When the Supreme Court made a decision that was controversial, trust would fall, but then it would bounce back up, right? And what we're seeing now, I think more is that line is just trending down, right? So there's still some bumps and movements and up and down, but overall, there's a consistent decline of trust in a number of institutions across society. Some are exempt from it. Some seem to find a way to continue to have high trust. But what does that mean, right? Why should we care about that? And I think at the end of the day, and this sounds almost a little corny, we should care about it because our institutions are the way that we find truth, and generally the way we try to get consensus around what that truth is and what our direction ought to be as a result of that. The heartfelt fear that I have is that in this grand topic of agricultural research and scientific innovation in the ag space, that if we don't redevelop some of that trust, we won't be able to arrive at a place where we all agree, well, what should be true about the next era of this work? And so for me, I'm inspired that we could have a small part of doing what Yuval Levin is calling for, which is, okay, let's then don't destroy these institutions. Let's help rebuild them. And the hard work is to rebuild them from the inside. Right? It is one thing to be performative and to bounce up on top of them. And he talks about that a lot too. It's a much hard, it's also easy to destroy them, right? To just end them, to blow them up. But the hard work is getting in them and generating the credibility both inside and without them that you are actually able to rebuild them. So that's not necessarily about the academy at the moment. It's not necessarily about CAST at the moment or anything like that. It is just acknowledging that to me is the moment that we are in. And if that's true, let's pick a space like CAST, like the Academy, like science and technology and innovation direction in the US, particularly as it relates to how we spend public dollars. Let's find that place and then let's try to rebuild from the inside. And frankly, as you can tell, I mean, I get kind of carried away. You might have to edit some of that and make it shorter or speed it up. I wish I could be one of those podcast people that I wanted to slow down and listen to, but I probably am one that people are going to want to speed up. But I think that's the answer to your question. I mean, I think the answer to why do you think we need it? I think we need it because it's a way of rebuilding trust in the institution that is so important to the future of American agriculture and innovation. Take even that. Why is it important in the long term? Why is American agriculture and innovation? I think a lot of times we hear things like, there's a fear motivation. Somebody else is going to get ahead of us, right? Like we're not going to have food security. And trust me, I believe that, right? Like I am worried about some of our international competitors that it feels like we are falling behind. And I'm a true believer based on some of the other work that I've done in my career that food security is national security. So I'm not taking any of those things for granted, but I'm also saying just morally speaking, we have an obligation, I think, to just make what we've got better. I mean, we are super blessed in this country. And so we've got an obligation to make it better, whether we are in fear of being beaten or not. Trust me, I'm a hate to lose guy, right? Like I don't celebrate victories very long, but I really, really hate to lose. And I mull over losses for a long time. And so I care about that, not losing to our international competitors. But the real North Star here ought to be, we can continue to do better. We've done that now in particular for 70 years since World War II with ag innovation, and we can do it again. And super fun to be a part of that, even in an era when people are trusting our institutions less and less.
How do you think a National Academy of Agriculture should structure its governance, transparency, and communication to earn that more broad confidence that you're aiming towards?
Yeah, you certainly can't flip a light switch, right? Like it takes time. And again, go back to the things we've said earlier that I won't repeat about process, but to some extent being inclusive and having a process that people feel like they can plug into. Two stories to help illustrate my answer to this question around how do we earn the broad confidence in an agricultural academy. One is working around politicians. and sometimes literally being in what we call a caucus room, right? Like this would be a portion of the members of a body who are getting together and vetting out what is our position before we walk out of these doors. And particularly when you're in the majority, that is important, because assuming you can walk out of that caucus room uniform, then your agenda, in fact, will prevail, right? But if some people get picked off, then you got to go back and do the math. And as a staffer, you never wanted to have a bill that failed on the floor of the House or on the Senate. You did the work ahead of time to know where people were going to be, so you know how they would vote. So in caucus, there was sometimes a temptation to pressure members when you did not have their vote. And I was fortunate to work for a speaker, Tom Tillis. Again, he's a United States Senator now. He is, in my mind, super unfortunately going to retire at the end of this year. I'm very excited about the folks that are running to replace him. But with that said, I put him on a pedestal. I mean, he was my employer, so I got to work with him very closely. But he would always put the caucus at ease by saying this phrase: first, you have to vote your conscience. We're not going to ask you to do something that is against a belief you have or a deeply held position that's important to you. So vote your conscience. Number two, vote your constituents, right? There may be a part about this that is harder for your part of the state than another part of the state, or harder for your part of the country than another part. You better look out for your constituents, because that's what they send you here to do. So vote your constituency. And then third, if neither of those things inform your vote or prevent you from going with the caucus, vote your caucus. The lesson in that is you got to you can't outrun your constituency. You certainly can't outrun your conscience, right? Like you can't do something that you believe is morally or ethically wrong. But second, you can't outrun your local constituency, because that's not how the system works. We're not asking you to do things that hurt your own constituency. The goal here is to find things that help enough people. You don't have to vote against your own constituents, even if you end up on the losing side of an issue. And I think translating that into this process, it means we got to listen to our stakeholders. We can't outrun our constituents. We have got to have a way to test our plans with them and to get their perspectives at the table. So that's one, listen to your stakeholders. And then it's interesting, I use the word stakeholders there a little bit intentionally. Understand the stakes, right? This is moral leadership work. This is not just one more thing that we have to do. So my second story is I actually ran for a large church in Raleigh. I ran a director of music search one time. I was a member of the church. I'm a little bit of a musician. I play the piano. Let me be clear. There are pianists, and then there are people that play the piano. I just play the piano. But somehow I landed on this committee. Our church has an incredible music program. It's a large church, several thousand members. And I found myself leading this process. And there was a group of folks in the church that were not people who played the piano. They were pianists as far as that goes, right? They were absolutely phenomenal musicians. And we needed to consider their input. They knew what they were talking about. But at the end of the day, we also needed that group of people to understand this is not about you, right? Like there is a reason music is a part of the worship service. There is a contribution it makes to putting our minds in a transcendental stage to think more bigly, if you will, than ourselves. And so when you're in a conversation about finding a director of music, it's not just about who you want to work with or who's going to make the choir sound the best or who do you like the most. It is literally about a larger mission. And so what I would say to my colleagues on the CAST Advisory Council and to those that are interested and willing to come to the table and help us with this work is that, frankly, at the end of the day, if we do this right, it's not about us. It is a chance to be a part of something that's, at least for a small period of time in the grand scheme of history, somewhat transcendental, maybe outlast us a little bit or leave something behind that puts ag in a better place. But I think as long as we're guided by those two principles, that idea of listening to our stakeholders and then second, understanding what's at stake, then that makes this pretty fun work, right? That's how we earn confidence if we've done those two things.
So talking a little bit more about those stakeholders that you brought up, what kind of partnerships, university, industry, producer groups, government agencies are essential for the SAC and potential for the National Academy of Agriculture to succeed?
Yeah, it's an easy answer. It's probably unsatisfactory, but the easy answer is all of them. right? It is literally the all of the above, with one caveat, assuming they're not cynical, right? I mean, that goes along with this loss of trust in institutions and the moment we're having in the United States for the time being. I hope it's for the time being. Any willing participant that shares that goal of ours, that big what's at stake understanding, and is not merely interested in just making noise or sort of kicking up dirt, we want them at the table. We want them to be involved. And so I would just invite folks, particularly anybody that happens to hear this, if you feel like you bring that perspective and you've not been included, then reach out to us. That's what we're here for. That's why we've got more than a couple dozen people on this advisory council. Someone will be able to find time to reach out to you and get your perspective. So all of them. Now, that said, I think that creates a tension, and all of life is a tension, right? Like you got to weigh things and equipoise it all the time. But the risk here is that we also have to move. We also have to go, right? I mean, the CAST board is giving us an assignment, giving us a bit of a deadline, and we got a truck. So if folks are interested, you got to come to the table quick. You may not get, as they do in Harry Potter, no animal may drop off a gold-laced invitation, but please raise your hand, come see us regardless, seek us out, and you'll certainly be taken seriously, assuming you're taking the work seriously. So all of them is the answer. The universities, the industry, the producer groups, all of them. We want all of them at the table.
So a question that a lot of listeners might be wondering, what do you think the effect will be on agriculturalists, scientists, policymakers, and the general public? How are people who aren't directly involved going to be able to see the effects of the Strategic Advisory Council and the National Academy of Agriculture?
I hope it's, again, this may sound a little heady, but I hope it is that this entity becomes a place where people can convene and trust each other and trust the institution to produce a roadmap for, again, in particular, public investment in agricultural science and innovation, but that is woven in beautifully and reliably and mutually beneficial to the private sector. I mean, I hope at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, right? I mean, I hope the impact is that our efforts lead to the establishment of a venue, of an entity, of a place where there is consensus around our priorities in agricultural innovation and research in the United States.
What makes you really optimistic as you look into the next decade of American agriculture? You've worked in ag policy and agriculture for a long time. What are those trends and innovations that give you the most confidence that U.S. agriculture will be able to meet the challenges it faces in the future?
Yeah, just to go back to a little bit of my introduction, and that is there's a next generation out there that's going to completely blow our minds, right? I mean, the folks that have been fortunate enough to grow up in the digital era where that is their native language. And Kaylee, you're probably in that generation. When I am around that group of people, I'm just amazed because I think they keep the pride and the understanding of the importance of agriculture, but at the same time, they've got all these capabilities that people of my ilk can just sort of marvel at. So I think next generation is something I'm very optimistic about, next generation of agricultural leadership. And you see this, if you go to the FFA convention, 4-H events, even at a Farm Bureau or a National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, you'll see events that are tailored to younger families, younger farmers, and it's just super impressive. I think the other big thing that gives me optimism is, notwithstanding everything we've said about trust in our conversation today, looking back at the data, people trust farmers. People think farmers are doing the right thing at the end, despite I've got a book out there called Farmers versus Foodies, and it's a lot about this notion that people call the food system broken. But even when they do that, there is sympathy for, and even the current administration, I think, has tried to do this in a good way. They've said there are things we want to change, but we love our farmers. And I think that's them reading the room, right? Understanding that farmers have a high level of trust. And as long as we have that, that's a pretty good operating base to come from, assuming we listen to them and we involve them in our processes and our thinking. There's a reason people trust farmers to do the right thing and think they're a kind of a wholesome lot, if you will. And so I'm optimistic about that. I'm glad that is not eroded. We sometimes do circle the wagons and shoot at each other, even in the farmer space. saying I grow it one way, you grow it another way, your way's wrong, my way's right. But I think we've done better, frankly, about that in very recent years, and said, look, there's room at the table for everybody. We can all supply the American consumer with what they want, even if what they want is not what I want. And so I'm optimistic about those two things, the next generation, and then maybe a third thing. In Yuval Levin's book, he talks about this notion of people need to come forward and help rebuild these institutions. Again, I think that's what we're doing, right? So if we want to get beyond this cultural era of lack of trust in institutions, I think this is a part of doing it, which is unfortunately why I had to say yes to this, even though I had a full plate, right? Like, you can't be out there preaching, we need to rebuild our institutions, and then you have a chance to help rebuild institutions and build trust. And I think I'm excited about who's coming along next, and the fact that as long as farmers are in our corner, we're pretty insulated from many of those comments about how dumb we are.
We covered a lot of space, but is there anything else that you'd want to share with folks who are listening?
It's hard to know who listens to these things, but I would say if I did not at any point mention the space in which you work in agriculture, that was not intentional, right? So I just want people to hear we really do want to be collaborative. We do really want to be inclusive. Help us with that. Be in touch with us. And frankly, a big part of that is people that are already in government, right? I mean, I think there's I said this yesterday, actually, at a conference that I was emceeing, a Wildlife Resources Commission employee, which we normally think about them as helping run the game wardens in the state. So if you're a hunter, you kind of have a love-hate relationship with them. But in reality, we need really good people in government and across government institutions that are public service minded, but that are also really, really capable and smart. And so particularly to that group, right, we recognize this does not happen without them, with their input and direction and their leadership too. And so that's probably it. I mean, that's all I would add at the end is, if in any way I have said something that made somebody feel like they were not included or not invited to be at the table, that was absolutely not my intention. But as you can tell, a lot of enthusiasm around it, excited about what we're doing, and we got to get to work.
That was Ray Starling, Chair of the CAST Strategic Advisory Council, in conversation with Kaylee Kleitsch, Programs and Engagement Manager at CAST. The SAC is currently in its early phases of work and will present recommendations to the CAST board by mid-2026. If you want to learn more about it, visit cast-science.org. If you found this episode useful, please share it with a colleague. You can subscribe to the CAST Pulse podcast wherever you listen. And find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, X, Instagram, and Facebook. We are at CAST Ag Science across all platforms. Thanks for listening.